What topic pulled you into the deepest rabbit hole? Story 1. Missing persons. People have no idea how hard it is to find someone in the wilderness, especially if they aren't trying to be found. The bodies are there, just never found. Sometimes people stumble upon the remains, but it's usually a coincidence. When I was learning about bushcrafting, one of the first things that I learned is that nature is absolutely unforgiving. If you go into the wilderness unprepared, you can absolutely disappear without a trace. It doesn't give a crap about keeping you alive, and if you get lost in the wilderness, your body probably won't be found. That lesson was really cemented when a buddy and I hit the Appalachian Trail and weren't nearly prepared enough. We had gear for about 30 degrees F weather because it was supposed to hit 50 degrees. We got about 10 miles into the trail and got hit by a freak blizzard. We were trapped on the trail with a ton of snow and a wind chill of 20 degrees. We hunkered down and I managed to stay conscious. My buddy went into hypothermia and ended up passing out. That's very, very, very bad. And I managed to cuddle his butt until he was warm enough to wake back up. I vaguely remember one point in the night where I thought I saw a bear in our camp. I might have been hallucinating because my body was shutting down though. And when I looked down at my gun and bear spray, they were buried under at least 6 hours of snow, and neither would have been functional. We got the EF off of the trail right after the sun came up, and I don't ever let him forget that I cuddled with him to save his life. Don't underestimate the wilderness. It will absolutely kill you without hesitation. Story 2. The Life of Harry Houdini. I was working on a historical novel idea a couple years ago that wove fictional events into historical 1926 New York City. My main character encountered several notable locations and places, and Houdini, his home, magic, and family, played a major role. There is so much of Houdini's life that is fascinatingly well documented. There are also tantalizing unknowns that keep both historians and magic buffs intrigued until today. Weird facts. He was the first to pilot an airplane in Australia. When World War I broke out, he trained U.S. troops how to escape prisoner shackles if they were captured by the enemy, and how not to panic if trapped underwater, such as in a torpedoed ship. He knew and collaborated with H.P. Lovecraft, who ghost wrote an adventure story set in Egypt in Houdini's voice. They were collaborating on a book debunking superstitions at the time of Houdini's death. His house in Harlem was wired with a secret microphone system permitting him to eavesdrop on visitors and then appear to have mind-reading powers. He purchased an actual Egyptian mummy which rattled around in his basement, much to his wife's chagrin. I could do this all day. Check it out. Story 3. I saw something about governments that weren't recognized by the US, which led me to looking up failed states, which led me to 90s Somalia, which led to the situation in Mogadishu that the US got involved in, which led to the Black Hawk Down incident, which led to stories and recounts from people that were there and survived, which led to other stories from military people about other events like the capture of Saddam Hussein. Eventually, it led me to finding a story of a guy that lost his leg from an RPG and went on to start a distillery, which led me to look to see what a trip to North Carolina would cost to check out the distillery and what else I could do while there. Then I started wondering what I would say to the owner if I had a chance to meet him, because of how damn inspiring I found his story. Which led me to think, what the hell am I doing with my life to be awesome? Which led me to ordering Taco Bell and watching a live stream. Story 4. For a little while, I couldn't stop reading about Action Park, a water or amusement park that was open in New Jersey from the late 70s until 1996. Basically, the whole place skirted a ton of rules and regulations, and 6 people died on rides. There were also literally thousands of injuries. The owner would pay employees $100 to test out crazy new rides. They had a slide that went completely upside down. It was, not safe. There was a giant human-sized hamster wheel they tested by rolling down a hill. It rolled down the hill, broke the fence, and crossed the highway with someone inside. I recommend the documentary Class Action Park on HBO, or you can just see some crazy rides and old footage on YouTube. Story 5. The passing, or dare I say murder, of Adam Lax, and along with his father. When I say you will go down a rabbit hole, you definitely will. Family had a farm. Farm got contaminated downstream from a bunch of industrial waste runoff. There were also trenches dug on their property that in turn diverted waste into their farm from the river, thus contaminating their entire farm and water supply. Father got cancer first, ended up passing away. Was later determined he was poisoned by a nurse, and the medication used to poison him was stolen from a pharmacy where someone very important in the local government's wife either owned or managed. The nurse later admitted to poisoning him, but did not give any other information on how she obtained the medication. Son was then found deceased after he chased unmarked vehicles off the property one evening. The story his mother gave us was absolutely horrendous. There's so much more than what I've said, hours and hours of crap you can look through. It's the only story I ever told where I started to get death threats to take it down from throwaway accounts across various forms of social media, including Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. Story 6. Paranormal. So many people experience it, and every concept in folklore has some connection and link to stories events that took place. Almost all horror movies lend some concept slash story slash origin already existing in cultures. It's easy to understand that most people don't believe in it, but what about the people who actually experienced it? Did they all imagine it or have some mental issues? Some of us know people in real life who experienced some paranormal encounter, or a famous place that is supposed to be haunted. Why is there not proper research to either debunk it or have proper proof? Story 7 started around 18 when I first watched JFK, and is an ongoing rabbit hole of mine for over 2 decades now. Seen the public perception of it shift from in favor of a conspiracy to acting like it's a bizarre idea, thanks QAnon. I still remain firmly in the camp that there was a conspiracy. You really have to turn on some blinders to not see that there was one. In 1959, a U.S. Marine left the Corps and defected to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. How many U.S. citizens do you think were able to do that during that era? 4 in the 1950s, including Oswald. All except one were involved with the U.S. military. Then the next year, 1960, 5 more defections to the Soviet Union, including 2 people from the NSA and 3 U.S. Army personnel, including a man who worked directly with military intelligence. Oswald came back to the U.S. in 1962, no problem. Nothing strange about that at all. Then a little over a year later, he successfully assassinates the president, and then 2 days later is murdered by a club owner with mob ties while being escorted to the county jail, thereby avoiding a trial. Because the club owner just felt bad for Jackie? All of this happening while the doctors in Dallas are botching what could possibly be the most important autopsy in American history? Craziest set of coincidences of all time if none of this was tied to a conspiracy. Story 8. The Brainwashing of Jamie McGonigal by her mom Lynn. She's the That's True girl on YouTube. I went on a deep dive of Lynn's YouTube channel and even managed to find the recordings of their old Christian radio podcast when the two took their pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. It's crazy seeing the change Jamie goes through as she is continually force-fed her mother's crazy theories. Luckily, it seems these days Jamie has managed to make something good out of her experience, but no one will be able to convince me that her mother didn't mess her up from a very early age. Story 9. Changing my thesis. Question from how will corals adapt to climate change to understanding that they've survived every mass extinction, and experientially watching their full recovery in experiments where they had died, held tissue in their porous skeletons, and realizing the real question is, how are corals adapted to climate change? It's led me down the Holy Grail hunt since 2012, the immortal polyp that I have hypothesized for greater than a decade now, that we can use to seed life elsewhere and say F. Fermi's paradox. Story 10. Hundreds throughout my life. I love it. It's one of the fun parts of being a nerd. A recent one that comes to mind is making vanilla extract at home. I learned vanilla is like wine and that there are tons of different kinds and ways of making it. Different beans from different places have different flavor profiles. They can be extracted in different alcohols, so it can be quite the rabbit hole. I have 2 different extracts at the moment, both in a 50% Everclear, 50% distilled water mix. One is fruity with hints of raisin, fig, and nutmeg. The other is deeper with notes of dark chocolate and black pepper. One of the only reasons I still have Facebook is to have access to India's Vanilla Bean Co-op. They are so knowledgeable and have amazing beans for great prices. They even have bean fairies who kindly give beans away. Story 11. Phosphor bronze because of Prince Charles costing the British Navy 1.5 shekels of it. I'm trying to figure out how much that actually costs, and what exactly it is and how it's used. Why is it so valuable? The myths around tireless duty and being at the beck and call of the country, government, and citizens. The inner workings of the very rarefied world which the royals and aristocracy inhabit, and the pipeline of their schooling and government, business, the armed forces, and the church. I want to know exactly how much power these people really have. I would quite like to know if I can find any financial information surrounding their private income. I'm not a royalist. I'm definitely not a fan. They own more land and properties than anyone else on the planet. I find it repulsive but fascinating. It's morally bankrupt and just totally depraved. I saw a quote attributed to Tupac along the lines of America being run by officially sanctioned criminal gangs, and it resonates with me. It's just as true along the corridors of power all around the world, and I like knowing about things that the powers there don't want one snooping around. Story 12. Not sure how a bunch of random tiny ball of energy can come together to form an atom, and then these basic crap contacts and creates tissue, then a whole functioning brain that can process color thoughts, image speech, and whatnot. I mean, there's no way all this crap is real. In reality, our brain is nothing but a giant ball of energy. I mean, us, the entire Earth, universe, is nothing but a giant ball of energy. A giant ball that's made up of trillions of tiny balls of energy. These tiny balls of energy, have no purpose, no point, their existence so simple and basic, and yet they just make us, I just can't grasp how, in basic form, all these tiny balls of energy is literally identical and the same. But just because they're stuck together in different amounts, they can possess completely different purpose, like having them singularly, well, you have hydrogen, but add a few more in. Now you have a solid, carbon, add another one. Now we're back to being a gas mind-blowing story 13. Some friends and I were discussing the movie Hercules, Disney, and questioning the muses being of African descent. So I Googled it, and it turns out that Greeks of that time were closer to Africans than to whites, which I found fascinating. Then I came across someone's dissertation on ancient Greek skin, hair, and eye color, and found out that blonde in ancient Greek writings would have actually referred to a medium brown hair, solidly brunette to our eyes, and red eyes were what we would call amber. The term red hair originated at this time because to the ancient Greeks and their dark hair, that bright orange would have looked red to them. The whole thing was fascinating. Story 14. A couple of years ago, I hypothesized that the major differences between Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans would be modern equivalents of people who lived in those areas. So under my theory, modern East Asians would have more Denisovan characteristics, modern Europeans would have more Neanderthal characteristics, and people from Africa would have the most Homo sapiens characteristics. I was very wrong. The modern look of humans today is a result of our environment. We looked very different 10 to 15,000 years ago. We will look different 10 to 15,000 years from now. But what was supposed to be a 5 to 10 minute search has now been like an 8-year casual obsession. Story 15. My boss asks what I think about their roles as a boss basically, and how they treat associates, and I continuously say, you don't want to know. Eventually brought me to being honest, getting into a heated discussion, and they took it personally, continued to harass me in a passive-aggressive way, then made me cry twice, brought me into the office 3 times. Ha! Then a survey for how our managers and such were doing in the office came up about a week later. I was completely honest about it. Let's just say it's about 6 months later and they've left me alone, and are now more professional, try harder, communicate better, and our office has only been growing since then. Haha, it feels great to just be honest and trust in God. Story 16. John Wayne Todd. He was this preacher who claimed to have been a witch, except he said that witches secretly control the world. He's one of those people you never heard of, whose fingerprints are all over the conspiracy world. He was a nobody who was ripping off other conspiracy preachers. But after he died, his conspiracy theories made it all the way to the Christian identity movement and Osama bin Laden. He was the guy who literally told Randy Weaver to move to Ruby Ridge. He ended up in prison with something like 200 allegations of child molestation while he worked as a karate teacher. Story 17. When I was in 2nd grade, I remember learning simple rules for determining if a number is divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 5. For 2 and 5, you look at only the last digit. For 3, you take the sum of the digits. And for 4, you look at the last 2 digits. You can do 6 by combining the rules for 2 and 3. I remember asking my teacher what the rule was for divisibility by 7, and he said, "There is no rule for 7 as far as I know." This infuriated me. My friend Paul and I spent weeks trying to figure out a rule for divisibility by 7, and eventually gave up. In hindsight, this was my first mathematical research problem. A few decades, and 1 PhD later, I'm still essentially doing the same thing. Not the divisibility by 7 things, but rather the math research thing. Story 18. Neuroscience and how the hell the brain works in general. The fact that this slab of electrified meat is just piloting our bodies, and how said slab of meat can be influenced by so many things, is insane. Even things like hallucinations, that our brains can just make things that aren't real from nothing. How different populations, white or black or from different geographical regions, can be more or less likely to have mental disorders, how genetics influence our brain. It's freaking nuts. If you really want to go down a rabbit hole, there's also a handful of articles and blogs and whatnot talking about how mental disorders may have been beneficial evolutionarily, like ADHD being useful for foraging and whatnot. It's crazy. Story 19. Maybe not the deepest, but ended me in the deepest hole afterwards. How does B. anthracis be so lethal when inhaled but only cause minor infection at its worst when in a cut? Ended up concentrating in microbiology for my undergrad, and ended up in public health. Also had some visitors at my on-campus apartment as I dug really deep with my biology curiosity and my roommate's national security intelligence curiosity. To answer this without causing issues for y'all, when inhaled, it is an endospore, so your body ignores it, storing it in the lymphatic system, where it gets body-wide and your body doesn't realize it until it's too late. When in a cut, it's active as a bacteria, so your body just takes care of it real quick at the site. I will not go into detail on how deep the hole was. I ended up going down, and will not answer most questions. Story 20. How sound works. Read everything, and all links to links on Wikipedia and other sources. Library books on audio. online audio engineering classes, produced some audio from live recording to mastering, read a few more books about human voice, 5-year side project for controlling computers hands-free using mostly voice, and some head movement, still at it, still baffled by how sound works. It's magic, and we get to touch and play and use it every day. Story 21. I decided to have a look at human perception in my master's degree, ended up in a scientific rabbit hole of neuropsychology, and eventually gave up when theta brainwaves started to pop up. My conclusion is basically that our visual sense is a fascinating mess of finely tuned mechanisms that a drunk 3-year-old put together with scotch tape and a rubber hammer. It's honestly amazing that we humans can even move our eyes without falling over. But on the other hand, our visual sense is completely glitchy and buggy, and our brain just randomly guesses most of the time. Story 22. If religious fundamentalism is obsessed with proving the Bible is literal and everything is true, what do the world fundamentalists want to look like? The answer is actually the end of the world. Just like Flat Earth, Noah's Ark, creationism, anti-gay, male superiority, and so many other wacko things in the Bible. Fundamentalists want the end of the earth to happen and will use their powers to make that happen. We are living part of their efforts now, in fact. One of the requirements for the end times to happen is the Jews returning to Jerusalem, even though there was no actual evidence outside of religious texts this ever was their homeland. Religious fundamentalism is a death cult, and they seek the end of the world. It is likely that they will do whatever they can to actually kill all of us on the planet. Story 23. My sister doesn't believe in anything unless she knows it to be fully 100% fact. She refuses to make theories, guesses, or take chances because it involves a level of uncertainty. This doesn't seem like a healthy mindset, and it's riddled with holes, like the classic "you don't know that chair isn't going to break, but you still sit on it without testing it first." It's not that big of a deal, but the issue is, she vocally complains how the actions of other people only make sense to you, not to anyone else because it involves taking a risk. She seems to believe that the vast majority of people in the world are like her, only believing what they know to be absolute fact and never taking any risks of any kind. It should have been clear to her by now that since she has complained this way to multiple people, that means there are clearly multiple people who don't think the way she does. She doesn't care to listen to any reasoning or justification to why a person takes any sort of risk, as she believes every reason to be invalid since it involves believing in something you don't know to be true. I haven't yet tried to argue with her beyond simply using science to explain the logic behind how some patterns are predictable, and we can have a reasonable belief that something will happen, because it has happened consistently before under similar circumstances. She dismissed that idea, again saying, "That only makes sense to you, not to anyone else." I wasn't even talking about anything extremely risky. What she recently dismissed was the idea that the tide rises predictably with the orbit of the moon. She seems to instead believe that the tide is chaotic and doesn't follow any set pattern, so you can't believe it will behave any particular way. She doesn't know that there will indeed be a low tide following a high tide. Instead, there might be multiple low, lower, lowest tides back to back with no high tides in between, or multiple high, higher, highest tides back to back with no low tides in between. Or the tide might stop changing and stay constantly at one level with no more waves for several days. Really? Does that actually make more sense? Story 24. Rat Utopia basically made me think that humanity is self-extinguishing. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a cage that gives everything a rat wants in their life. The population explodes so space becomes a limited quantity. Eventually, society completely decays, and the rats all die off, all while the resources are being provided. But the observed behavior of rats get really weird and mirror a lot of human breakdowns. For example, some eats become completely secluded, hikikomorous. Others become incredibly vain. Female rats shied away from courtship, so on and so on and so on. It's just super easy to juxtapose that with what's going on in our society now. Story 25. This catalog that came to the wrong place has meteorites in there. I didn't know you could buy those. Simple enough, right? 24 years later, and I've got chunks of around 150 different falls and finds. I did some work with a NASA partner on asteroid research, have done deals where I've either traded or sold pieces to museums around the world, read papers about the geologic history of Mars that were based on material I provided, had my website be the second one listed behind NASA's site when Sky and Telescope did an article on meteorites, got my copy of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Meteorites signed by the author when I worked with him on a display at a planetarium, started an international association of dealers and collectors with members on every continent in my living room, loaned pieces of my collection for museum displays, supported my family by buying and selling them for a while, and have actually made more money than I've spent building up a world-class collection that includes the largest privately owned chunk in the world of one specific asteroid out there. Story 26. Well, back in 2012 to 14, I can't remember exactly when, but I was a young child still, I saw a video online of a man cutting his own private parts up with a hatchet like he was Gordon Ramsay. I was being taught about fourth grade history at the time, so the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, that sort of thing. I absolutely hated it. I was not interested in history at all. But why did I mention the video? Well, come fifth grade, we started learning about none other than World War I and World War II. Since I was desensitized to gore and violence at that point, and for some reason had a weird interest in it, and I don't mean by me being violent, I mean by violence in general. So I went down the uncensored rabbit hole of the world wars. The best way I can describe what happened next is, imagine an hourglass shape. Now imagine very slowly descending like a feather falls from the air. At first I was in the top section. I had a childhood where I was oblivious to the world as a whole. Before fourth grade, I had thought wars were made-up stories, mind you. I'm talking about the romanticized version of Greek history that we learned in third grade, of which I remember nothing except the fact that we were taught it. As soon as I descend far enough down the bottleneck portion of the hourglass that I'm at the exact narrowest point, is when I went down that rabbit hole. I found out about the truth of this world, and I remember receiving so much information from my initial dive that my brain pretty much short-circuited. I was confused, appalled, interested, and for some reason felt pleasure. I was pleased to actually learn about history. It was like the flip of a switch, as my teacher put it. One day I was so unmotivated to put in the effort to do the work. The next day you would have thought I was high as crap on some kind of drug. To this day, I still enjoy learning history, and I don't think I will ever not enjoy it. It's my distraction from the world around me for when I need it, no matter how grotesque it is described as.